What goes up must come down. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, 2026, and shares of Keel Infrastructure closed at around, I think, $2.04 a share, down from yesterday on volume of about 20 million or so shares. You know, this stock is likely to keep going up and down with no real sense of direction, absent there being a meaningful news release, specifically as it relates to, I believe, Moses Lake. Now, why am I suggesting Moses Lake may very well be the first of the multiple sites that Keel Infrastructure has at its disposal to garner a news release that pertains to a deal, a co-location, tenants having been found and terms having been agreed upon? Why do I believe that? Well, Panther Creek, without a doubt, clearly needs a bit more time, right? Based on what Ben shared during the most recent investor presentation, based on research which I've uncovered, based on just, being at the site and not really seeing anything happening and knowing that we have all these extra permits that need to be obtained and the, waiting for this data center ordinance to go into effect so there can be some clarity as to what's actually going to be in that ordinance. Moses Lake, by contrast, it's a very different picture. There's 18 gross megawatts of power available at that site. It's not a huge site, but it's something, okay? As you may or may not recall, right, Keel Infrastructure has already allocated, I think, over like $100 million, right, towards the construction and conversion of that site. And that was announced back in November of 2025. So that money's already been allocated. At this juncture, there was a comment in the investor presentation about potentially acquiring some additional land right there that might conceivably increase, right? Well, obviously it would increase the footprint of any future data center there. I believe they're aiming for a 60,000 square foot data center, but it could potentially mean a larger data center. And it sounds as if though there's conceivably an angle through which some additional power could be essentially acquired as a result of acquiring, this additional parcel. Now, at this point, though, I'm not convinced that any sort of potential deal with a co-location tenant is contingent upon some additional land acquisition and the attempt to acquire some additional power. And the reason I say that is because already the Moses Lake site, as we understand it to exist, as it has been presented, as it is likely being marketed right now, is perfectly suitable, right? It's not going to be a massive data center, at least certainly not by data center standards that we've been talking about, right, the last couple of years as it relates to HPC AI. By any rational definition, an 18 megawatt facility is huge. Like absolutely huge. The amount of compute that will go into that data center, if had Keel Infrastructure, then known as Bitfarms, decided back in November of 2025 to pursue a GPU as a service model for Moses Lake, we already know that it would have cost upwards of $500 million to acquire said GPUs to put into that data center, not to mention the costs associated with actually building the data center. So we're talking about absolutely staggering sums of money. So Keel Infrastructure is not going to be getting into the GPU as a service business, but rather instead focusing on, hey, let's keep it nice and easy. Co-location. Hey, you want to have your stuff in our data center? That's awesome. You bring your stuff, right? We'll supply the data center. Super simple. And that's going to be the case across the entire portfolio. So at this point, we already know that, hey, if there is somebody interested in Moses Lake, they can sign a lease. They really can. And to the extent then there's going to be a process by which additional square footage is included in the deal. Maybe there's an addendum. Maybe there is an additional bit of power that can be available to the data center. I think that's icing on the cake. One thing that was mentioned during the third quarter of 2025 investor presentation, not to be confused with the most recent fourth quarter 2025 investor presentation, What was mentioned during the Q3 call was that the thinking at the time was that Moses Lake would likely begin to decommission some, or if not all, of its Bitcoin mining activities by the middle of this year. Now that hints at what is likely to be a scenario where meaningful construction truly begins probably in the next couple of months. Now, one could argue, hey, the company has not necessarily had the greatest track record in the world as it relates to making predictions and having those predictions come true. After all, Stephen, it was in that third quarter 2025 investor presentation that, hey, the CEO of Keel Infrastructure said that the expectation was that ground would be broken at Panther Creek in December 2025. That never happened. We later learned it had to do with a permit issue, full government shutdown situations that, sort of took place, which, as we discussed, were resolved the day before the third quarter 2025 investor presentation. Here we are, just about 5 months later, and we're still waiting, for there to be some resolution. So, Stephen, why would you cite the third quarter 2025 investor presentation as being any sort of reasonable evidence that Moses Lake, in fact, will start decommissioning its Bitcoin mining operations towards the middle of this year because of the construction that is likely to begin? Well, at this point, bear in mind that this is a fully funded construction project at this point, based on what was revealed in that November 2025 news release, whereby, hey, the money's been allocated. My understanding is at this point, I want to be careful. I don't know that the contractor has been paid $100+ million, just sort of like in one payment. That would surprise me. What's probably more likely is that, yes, the company has allocated the full amount internally, perhaps placed significant down payments, and now it's just a matter of getting a building permit, perhaps getting a couple of other things. I'm waiting for a couple emails to come in. I'm gonna hopefully have a little bit more specificity as it relates to what exactly is needed at this point. What is needed to literally walk onto that facility, which Keel Infrastructure already owns? And what if they just wanted to unilaterally disconnect every Bitcoin mining machine and bulldoze the whole damn thing? What if they wanted to do that? I mean, okay, do you need a demolition permit? Maybe. Do you need an ordinance to be passed? I hope not. Do you need, 7 to 12 months of deliberation to do that? I certainly hope not. So, there does come a point where you then start to wonder, okay, what really is the holdup here? And so, as I said, I'm waiting to get a couple emails. Hopefully I'll get some responses as to what might potentially be pending. I have a couple of hypotheses, but ultimately I've believed since about February of this year that Moses Lake had already reached so-called notice to proceed status within the company as of then. And by the way, NTP is typically not something that a governmental agency gives you a form that says notice to proceed. It's really something more that the developer of the project says, okay, you know what, we're ready to go. So, and again, you may have a slightly different experience with that. Just from the research I've done, though, I cannot find a sheet of paper that a municipal government issues that literally is called notice to proceed. This idea of notice to proceed, my understanding, it comes really from the developer, which in this case is Keel Infrastructure, right? They own the property. They're the developer. Yes, they're subcontracting out to various entities that are going to do the actual construction. And from what we learned as well, Keel is not interested in managing these sites, right? The goal is to have a professional management layer, people who really have, not just people, but like companies that have a lot of experience doing this sort of thing on the ground at these sites, managing them. So bottom line, you look at the stock price and you say, okay, do you start buying more? Do you buy more Keel Infrastructure? And, there's a part of me that says, yes, you do. But then there's also a part of me that says, there's a lot going on in the world right now. And as much as I have really tried to steer clear of all the geopolitical chaos, right, that has been taking place, it's kind of hard to ignore. So you say to yourself, hey, could this stock dip down below $2 a share if you have, a situation in parts of the world where oil fields are on fire, the production of various petrochemical products is now jeopardized, where supply chains are completely disrupted as it relates to oil, right? It's one of those things where, hey, you could conceivably see some significant market shocks, right? There's a degree of complacency that I know I feel within myself and that I sense the market sort of has as well, right? Hey, we hear these really bombastic, extreme, right, pronouncements, but then there always seems to be a walking back of those things, right? But there could come a point where there is no walking back anymore, right, from some of these threats or some of these pronouncements. And you may, in fact, have, situations unfold that are quite cataclysmic and quite significant. And, hey, whether a person might believe it's for the betterment of the world in the long run, or it's to the detriment of humanity in the long run, the short-term consequence is likely to be a significant disruption, right, in a lot of supply chains that pertain specifically to oil. And that does, in fact, have a bit of a ripple effect. And, hey, look, Keel Infrastructure, it's interesting, right? Hey, we talk about a keel, it's a part of a boat. Well, Keel Infrastructure is a very small boat in a very large ocean, right, within the stock market. And so when you get stormy seas, right, and you have those waves that are crashing all over the place, shares of Keel Infrastructure they're gonna take on some water, and that's not an indictment on the company and what they're individually trying to do. It's just more a reflection of market sentiment. Hey, autonomous programs that are just programmed to essentially sell everything if certain things happen. I'm not really sure what the right path is as it relates to this company's shares. My intuition is that anything under $2 is probably a pretty good deal. Of course, this not being investment advice, but rather just a reflection of what's going through my head for myself as I look at these shares and I say, hey, would I be interested in buying more shares? Hey, maybe under $2, that's kind of hard to pass up. You're looking at a company whose market cap, it's about $1 billion, give or take a little bit, right? Maybe 1.2 billion. I'd be hard pressed to imagine a scenario in which Keel Infrastructure, regardless of what's going on in the world, if this company begins to sign deals, begins to gain some traction, right? I'm hard pressed to believe that the company's valuation remains at about $1 billion or so dollars, right? In terms of the market cap. The big risk, of course, is dilution. There is going to be a raise. We know it's coming. The question is, okay, does it happen soon after a deal is announced? Does it happen the moment the stock starts to run up? Is it necessarily a at the market offering? Maybe not, probably not. I get the impression from hearing Jonathan Murr, right, the new CFO of Keel Infrastructure. Hey, it's just one of those things where we got to feel this out. I think if the stock were to really run up as aggressively as it did last October, we're probably going to see something, right? So there's that. But that in some ways is a good thing if it happens in the context of a deal. I think if it just happens for the sake of happening, I don't know. If you give a company too much runway, right? Hey, we've got 500 million in the bank. We've got 5 billion in the bank. Well, the company doesn't really have to do a whole lot of anything, right? A company like that could simply just, exist for decades. pretty much just treading water. Everybody gets paid, right? Who works there, whatever, there's no sense of urgency. You lose that sense of urgency unless you actually have that feeling of like, man, we got to go out there into the market. We got to make some sales. We got to generate some revenue. We got to make things start happening. If not, we're going to go out of business, right? When a company suddenly has endless amounts of money, I sometimes wonder if there's that hunger and that sense of like, we need to get this done as soon as humanly possible. So there's that. Bottom line, I'm not buying anything right now. I think from my perspective, I just want to wait and see how things perhaps unfold over the next several hours, the next several days. And, hey, look, I think all of us as humans, right, we want there to be peace. We don't want to see people, being harmed or injured or suffering unnecessarily. By the same token, hey, like we live in a world that's very complicated, and we live in a world where sometimes, things happen, and we need to just, as investors, kind of roll with it, whether we like it or not, and just kind of make the best of it and try to really seize the opportunity that geopolitical events might present to us. I mean, if Keel suddenly started retesting its 52-week low of 67 cents a share, you better believe there are going to be a lot of people backing proverbial dump trucks up to the stock market and trying to shovel as many shares as they can of this company into said dump trucks, right? Because that's a crazy price. Anything under $1 is insane, unless of course we find out that hey, Panther Creek has been claimed by eminent domain by the state or something like that, or the company's been nationalized and all their assets seized. Absent some really wackadoodle situation like that, we may have the opportunity to really get some interesting additional buying opportunities in shares of Keel Infrastructure. But again, hey, you got to do your own due diligence. You got to figure out what you want to do. I'm just talking out loud here, sharing some thoughts, not financial advice. I hate giving those disclaimers. It's so silly, but you know where I'm coming from. Okay, my friends, with all of that said, if you enjoy these broadcasts, as always, please like and subscribe. Let's stay positive. Let's be great. And we'll see each other again tomorrow.